Hello everyone, and welcome to your 8th Historical Geology lecture. This is Dr. Hurt, and we're going to be talking today about plate tectonics. So this is all here to get you prepared to understand geologic history. It's a little bit strange because we really haven't done any historical geology up until this point, right? It's just been all kind of review of physical geology, getting you acquainted with the ideas from physical geology necessary to understand historical geology. So it's kind of funny, but in a way this class is maybe 40% of physical geology. So for those of you who had physical geology, it's review, but for those of you who haven't, you definitely need this information. So we are going to be talking about plate tectonics today. And as you know, the surface of Earth is subdivided into all of these different plates, right? You see different ones here, the Pacific plate, right? The Cocos plate, right? It's a little small plate here off the coast of Central America. The Nazca plate here off the coast of South America. A lot of different plates, and those plates actually consist of both the lithosphere, the mantle, and the crust, right? Which is the two components of the lithosphere. So, anyway, let's take a look at just kind of reminding you about the structure of the Earth. This is like third lecture that we did was on Earth structure. So you got to remember that we have, of course, two types of crust, right? We have a continental crust and an ocean crust, and that below the crust is the mantle. But not all mantle is the same, right? Some mantle is asthenosphere and some mantle is lithosphere. Remember that lithosphere is the part of the mantle that is brittle-like. Lithos means stone. Okay, so it's the part of the mantle that's kind of like stone. The asthenosphere is astheno means no strength. So it's the part of the mantle that is more like maybe something like really stiff silly putty. It can break, but it can also bend and fold and deform and convect as well. Now, that's a really important part of the whole story of plate tectonics. So the lithosphere is the crust plus the strong part of the mantle. The asthenosphere is the comparatively weaker part of the mantle that can bend and deform. So the crust and the lithospheric mantle, these are the plates. So this is what you can think of as the plate. Okay, so the plate isn't just the crust, it's really the lithosphere. Okay, so that's what the different plates are referring to. So remember that the lithosphere is relatively cooler. Its temperature is well below the melting point. Okay, so this is the part of the lithosphere. Lithosphere usually goes down around 100 kilometers. So it's the part of the Earth that is well above well below the melting temperature. So this line here on this temperature depth diagram, this red line represents the melting temperature of the Earth. The black line represents the actual temperature of the Earth, or aka the geotherm. And you'll notice that the geotherm is well to the left of the melting temperature. It means it's much cooler than the melting temperature. Here, the asthenosphere is much closer to the melting temperature in the asthenosphere. And because of that, it is more like this bendable, malleable stuff that we're not quite used to. You can almost think of like really hot metal that is still solid, but it can deform. Okay? So the asthenosphere is relatively warm, but the essential difference between asthenosphere and lithosphere is not one of temperature. Okay? So if I ask you on the test, what's really the difference between asthenosphere and lithosphere? It's not the temperature, okay? It's the kind of mechanical properties of it. It's the mechanical properties. It's that the asthenosphere can bend and deform and flow, that can convect, and the lithosphere cannot. All right? That fact is a result of the temperature and pressure differences, but it's not, in essence, the difference between lithosphere and asthenosphere is not one of temperature. It's one of mechanical properties. All right, so another thing I wanted to hit on, I kind of touched on this a little bit before, but it's a pretty amazing fact. So if you go and look at the age of the different parts of Earth's crust, okay, because we can go take the rocks of Earth to a lab and analyze them and figure out about how old they are, okay? And we're going to get into all the gory details of this later in the class. What we find is that the ocean crust is relatively young. And it's like actually really, really young. So here's the ocean crust. You can see it's kind of color-coded in all these rainbow colors. The red colors mean it's young, even just thousands of years old. The blue is maybe up to 180 million years old. But you'll notice that there's nothing in the crust really older than 180 million years old in the ocean crust, sorry. So in the ocean crust, there's nothing really older than like 180 million years old. This is really crazy. Does this seem strange to you? The ocean is only 180 million years old. How old is the Earth? Hopefully you remember it's 4.5 billion years. It's not 180 million years. It's basically 4,550 million years old. So 180 compared to 4,550. So my point is 180 million compared to 4.5 billion is nothing. It's only 4% of Earth's age. Okay, so the oceans are really young, which is weird because you might have expected the oceans would be like the old part of Earth, like, you know, way down there. You don't even think about them. They seem like these great, dark, mysterious, abyssal parts of the Earth, but they're actually the young parts of Earth. What is old are the continents. You know, the continents' average age is 2.5 billion years. Okay, so some rocks are 4.5 billion years, right? So it's really a stark age difference. So that's another key point you got to remember, is that the ocean crust is young. And that all kind of makes sense. I mean, all this stuff, it seems to me like a factoid right now, but it's all going to come together eventually here. Now, the lithosphere is the rigid, kind of cookie-like, brittle, breaks, and it's going to kind of float on top of, if you want to use that word float, kind of float on top of this convecting asthenosphere. So it's the convection of the asthenosphere that is driving plate tectonics, that is driving plate motions. Okay, so the asthenosphere is convecting and it's pushing these plates. Sometimes the plates will collide here. Sometimes, you know, you get a trench. Part of the lithosphere will sink back into the mantle, be recycled. There are other places where the currents are rising and the plates are spreading apart. Okay, so a lot of what this lecture is going to be today is just giving you the historical background on how these ideas of plate tectonics came into being, where they came from, the kind of main personalities responsible for them. Okay, so this is a place, right, of plate collision here. This is a part of plate spreading. Okay, Earth's mantle is really kind of soft. It says Earth's mantle is a softie is my title to this slide, and it's I just kind of wanted to illustrate that that fact with this kind of cool real life fact or phenomenon that's occurring right now that I think is really neat. So it might surprise you, but Canada right now, or large parts of Canada, it's rising. Canada's rising. It's literally getting higher and higher every year. It's actually rising. Some places it's rising. You know, the sea levels in a lot of places are rising. You know, little millimeters per year, but there are places of Canada where the land is rising faster than the sea level. So what's that about? Why would Canada be rising up? Well, think about what was on top of Canada in the Ice Age 14,000 years ago. It was a lot of ice, right? I mean, a lot of ice. Like the amount of ice that was on top of Canada, you're talking about like 2 or 3 kilometers of ice. Really thick. It's kind of boggles the mind. It's hard to wrap your head around. But really thick ice layers. Okay, when that ice melted, during the end of the Ice Age, the last interglacial period. What happened? Well, all that weight was lifted off the continent, and the continent is literally rebounding right now. So Canada is literally rebounding from having that ice on top of it for so long, 14,000 years. It's still rebounding and kind of squeezing back up. And from this, actually, scientists have been able to calculate the viscosity of the mantle. It's pretty cool. So Canada's been rising up about 1/2 inch per year. So these are, maybe you've seen things like this before, but these are the rocks bending. These are synclines and anticlines, and you maybe have seen these in road cuts before. Maybe you didn't really understand what you were seeing, but this shows to you, proves to you that rocks can bend and fold, right? You can see it all here, right? Bended, folded, tortured rocks. So it's proof that, yeah, indeed, rocks can bend this way, okay? So Earth flows, Earth is flowing. And Earth is trying to shed its internal heat. It has a tremendous amount of heat inside. Think about the core. 1/3 of Earth's mass is just burning on fire. It's 5,000 degrees Celsius, right? Tremendously high temperature. And it's white hot. I mean, if you could see the core, you would be able to realize it's white hot. And think of all that heat, it's a tremendous amount of heat. And it's all trapped in the earth. And mantle convection is a way to release that heat. Okay. Mantle convection, it's behind all plate tectonics. So much plate tectonics is responsible for the everyday geologic observations we make. Earthquakes and volcanoes, and mountain building. And I mean, really, it's interesting because it's like most of geologic history, all the things we're going to be learning in geologic history, and evolution, part of it, like organic evolution of animals, is in the story too, where it was really a phenomenon associated with plate tectonics. I mean, like plate tectonics was a big driver of evolution because it was creating these, suddenly different landscapes, different environments. Animals had to adapt or go extinct. And it was also a big player in human evolution too, by the way. So it's a big story. Plate tectonics, there's no way to overemphasize how important of a phenomenon this is. Okay. So rocks, I have this reduce, reuse, recycle thing here because, that's what's going on. The lithosphere is recycling. It's dipping back into the mantle in some places. Subduction zones, it's coming back into the mantle. In other places, it gets reprocessed and brought back up. And it's this constant recycle convection cell machine that is recycling ocean crust and lithosphere and, burping it out in other places and absorbing it in other places. Okay, so the ocean crust is constantly recycled. The difference, though, is continental crust. Continental crust is not recycled. It does not go back into the mantle. It's too buoyant. It's not dense enough to sink back in there. Okay. So anyway, that's kind of the review of not plate tectonics, but kind of the review of just Earth structure that gets you to understand. Will help you to understand plate tectonics. So, right, the mantle is convecting. That's an extremely important fact about the Earth. Over geologic time, Earth's rocks really behave like a fluid. You could see the little image right here about how those things are swirling around the rocks, and that's not a liquid, right? The mantle's not a liquid. It looks like a liquid, but it's not a liquid. It's absolutely not a liquid. This simulation is occurring over hundreds of millions of years of geologic time, but over those large time scales, it looks for all the world like a liquid, doesn't it? But it's solid. It's absolutely solid. Okay, so let's talk about now plate tectonics and where this whole lecture is going to be just the history of where the plate tectonics theory came from. And it kind of started with a precursor theory called continental drift. So probably you've heard of continental drift before. It's just the idea that the continents, over time, they move around, they shift around. this little charmer right here, this guy, his name is Cynonathus. Cyno, C-Y-N-O, like that, Cyno. Oh, it's written down here. Cyno means actually dog or canine. Nathus refers to a jaw. So this is, this name Cynonathus would refer to like a canine-like, dog-like jaw. So this little animal lived in Africa, but also lived in Antarctica. We find fossils of him in Antarctica and South America. Okay, so you got to kind of imagine and put yourself back in time. It was actually not that long ago, maybe in the 1950s. And put yourself back in time and imagine that people didn't know about plate tectonics back then. It wasn't a thing, And imagine how perplexing this would have been. How is it that we have this animal, we find fossils of it living in Africa, Antarctica, and South America? Now, did he swim? How did he get rafted across somehow? Did he take a boat? How did he get across? Other questions are like, how could this animal live in Antarctica and Africa? Can you think of any animals that live in both Antarctica and Africa? Do elephants live in Antarctica too? No. Right? Do lions live in Antarctica? No. Do penguins live in Africa? I don't think so. I don't know any African penguins. So, and that's weird, How did that happen? People didn't have the idea back then that continents could actually move, right? So, the idea that continents, perhaps could move was really an idea that was of the 20th century. There were some early map makers in the age of mercantilism, and that when European voyagers were going all over the world, and they noticed that actually when they had mapped out the coastlines of different continents, they noticed that these coastlines really appeared to match up, especially South America and Africa. Almost everybody has noticed that. They really fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So, this man, Abraham Ortelius, wrote in 1596, America seems to be as if it were torn from Europe and Africa by earthquakes and floods, if you take a look at the coasts of all those continents. So nobody really proposed this, though, in a serious way until this gentleman came along, who's Alfred Wegener. Alfred Wegener was a polar climatologist. He was American, but spent a lot of his time in Greenland, working in Greenland. So he was always smoking a pipe, by the way. If you ever see him, he's like, almost every picture of him, he's smoking a pipe. He actually died some of the complications from smoking too much pipe tobacco. But he died in Greenland, by the way. And I don't know, this might be true if I remember correctly, but I'm not sure if anyone's ever found his body. I think maybe he might have died in Greenland. And I know this, at least, that he had all these notebooks from his research in Greenland, and they've never been discovered. They're buried somewhere in the ice in Greenland. So maybe, thousands of years in the future, we'll find Alfred Wegener's notes, missing notebooks. But anyway, it's kind of like cool, like hidden treasure that everybody's would like to find, because this guy's such a famous figure now in geology. So Alfred Wegener noticed that doesn't it look like the east coast of South America fits exactly with the west coast of Africa, as if they've once been joined, right? So this is an idea I have to pursue. This is in 1910 in a letter to his fiancée. I don't know how romantic of an idea that is to be talking with your fiancée about, but whatever, it was him. So we put together this idea, which is, now like we're very familiar with this idea, but at the time this was groundbreaking. This was just it's kind of crazy, because this was like, back then this was like a crazy idea. It's something that we're so used to now, but if you close your eyes and put yourself in this time period, 1920s, nobody knew about plate tectonics. The idea that the continents shifted around or moved around, isn't that a crazy idea? Doesn't that seem like the last thing that could possibly be true, that the continents shift around and scoot around over the surface of the Earth? So Alfred Wegener had this idea that all the continents were connected at one time, and he put together this one map called Pangaea, right? The one continent called Pangaea, in his book, very famous book, Origins of Continents and Oceans. So Wegener believed that the continents were at one time connected, but had somehow drifted apart over time. So he compiled evidence from 4 places to make his arguments. Okay, so these are 4 lines of arguments that you want to be familiar with. It's a pretty common question for me to ask this on the test of, please explain his 4 arguments. And notice I say explain. So on the test, it's not going to be enough to just say matching coastlines, geology, glaciation, fossils. Okay, you have to be able to explain these, explain what they mean, and explain how these theories support the idea of continental drift. Okay, so the first one's pretty easy, I think. It's just matching coastlines. So his first line of evidence is that, hey, look, at the coastlines, they match, right? They fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. Okay, that's clear enough. I don't think I need to explain that. Number 2 is matching geology. So matching geologic units and matching mountain belts. So if you do fit the continents all together, you'll notice that there are certain rock units that match together perfectly. So you can see this green rock unit, how it seems to match together really well on Africa and South America, right? It's pretty interesting. So that's kind of interesting. Also, mountain belts. There are mountain belts of the same age rocks on either side of Africa and South America that seem to fit together. Okay, so that's pretty interesting too. There, North America and Africa, Europe, Scotland, the UK, and the Pyrenees, and the mountains across Spain and Portugal. You can see that they all kind of fit together. So it's interesting. You find these analogous rock units on your side. This is just kind of this doesn't necessarily prove anything, but it's kind of like striking when, you put the continents together. You would see that West Virginia and Scotland would be pretty close together. And if you go and just take a look at just the countryside and see what it looks like, you'll notice that West Virginia, kind of looks like the Highlands of Scotland, right? So they're similar, right? Because the geology is similar. And what's cool is that you'll find the exact same rock types. Exact same rock types on either side of the coast, in the UK and in North America. So that's interesting. Okay, another thing that Wegener discovered, or I shouldn't say discovered, but noted, is that he had, of course, he was a polar climatologist. He knew a lot about glaciations and times in Earth's history in which there were more glaciers than there are now. So there was an ice age 14,000 years ago. It was actually a series of 20 different ice ages, but those huge. It's like mind-boggling how much ice we're talking about. Again, we're talking about kilometers, 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 kilometers of ice on top of the continents. That affects the continents. Okay, that leaves behind a lot of traces. Okay, now we talked about sedimentary rocks not too long ago, last week, and I mentioned about how the glaciers, when they move over the land surface, can polish it. They can leave striations, and that's exactly the kind of striation. That's exactly the kind of evidence that we find all over the Earth. And what's interesting is that we can track glacial movements from the direction of the striations and the scratch and scour marks left on Earth's surface. And if we put all the continents back together, we notice that these striations seem to kind of like make sense, like the glacial directions seem to make sense and match up. Okay, so that's what's shown here in this figure. Another thing that's also interesting to think about, we find glacial evidence for glaciers in India, like equatorial India and Africa. Okay, there are no glaciers there now. It's hard to imagine there ever being a situation in which there would be a lot of actually, there are proposed situations in which the Earth was entirely glaciated, but think of like equatorial Africa now. Isn't it kind of weird to think there were glaciers there at one time? Maybe it makes more sense to think that Africa was at a lower latitude at one time, closer to the poles. Or I'm sorry, a higher latitude, closer to the poles. So just things to think about. Fourth observation that Wegener made comes from that of fossils. So there are a lot of different fossils that are found on multiple continents that are separated by thousands and thousands of miles. And some of these animals and plants that Wegener was talking about there's no way they could have gotten across, like, for example, the Atlantic Ocean. Like, this little guy is called Mesosaurus. It's kind of hard to tell from this picture how big he is, and of course they make him look really big in this picture here, where he's the size of a continent. But Mesosaurus was pretty small. He was just like maybe think of like a iguana kind of size. So he was a swimmer, but he wasn't like a big animal. So we find Mesosaurus in both Africa and South America. But think about this. Isn't this weird that Mesosaurus was able to make this cross-Atlantic journey, but he couldn't make it like a little further into Africa or a little further into South America, like a little further north or a little further south? That's a little weird, you know? I mean, if this guy's capable of crossing the Atlantic, you think he could make it like a little further east in Africa or something like that. I just find that very strange. So again, it kind of makes more sense if these two continents were connected. And this isn't the only fossil, by the way. There's lots of different ones. There's Glossopteris. Like, there are plant fossils, like ferns. Like, come on, like, how does a fern cross the Atlantic Ocean? You know, it's found in Africa and South America, Glossopteris. You know, there are a lot of famous ones. I showed you Cynonathus before. But anyway, I think that's probably sufficient to make my point. So this is the fascinating thing about Alfred Wegener's life, is that he proposed all these different groundbreaking theories about how the continents move and shift over time, and he was roundly rejected. People just roundly rejected him, you know. He was rejected by the scientific community. People thought his ideas were crazy, and they do seem crazy. I mean, isn't it crazy to think that a continent, a mountain belt could move over time? It's a crazy idea, but it's true. I mean, sometimes that's the thing about nature. It's like nature's almost always stranger than you know, they have that famous saying, you know, fact is stranger than fiction. And I think that's really true, especially in the case of nature. Like, the natural world is so surprising, I guess is the word for it. So his hypothesis was rejected until maybe 30 years after his death. And part of the problem is that Alfred Wegener could not offer a mechanism. He couldn't explain how. He could explain what had happened. The continents had been together at one point and had separated, but he couldn't explain how that could have happened. He really thought that, and it sounds a little nutty, but he thought that the moon, the tidal forces from the moon, were enough to pull the continents in one direction or another. And physicists just laughed at him because they could show easily that that could not be the case. But anyway, he died, you know, never appreciated for what he was, and he was just this tremendous figure. Now he's just this tremendous figure in geology. So it had to wait until after World War II, really, for like the real evidence to show up that could show how this crazy idea of plate tectonics could occur, how the continents could actually be split apart. So World War II brought a lot of new technology, and some of this new technology, for example, was echo sounding. I'll explain a little bit about this later, but these are the three lines of evidence that kind of came after, geophysical evidence that came after World War II, after Wegener's death, and showed how the continents could split apart the way that they do. So this gentleman here is Harry Hess. Again, he was a captain of a naval transport during World War II. He did a lot, you know, you could imagine during World War II, people were very worried about German U-boats, right? So they were constantly measuring the depths, you know, of using echo sounding, echolocation to measure the depths of the ocean, searching for these U-boats. So Harry Hess made a lot of interesting observations when he was a naval captain, and he kind of brought that interest with him to Princeton. Later, he became chair of the department at Princeton, the geosciences department. And he went on this long career of exploring the ocean floor, okay, through echo sounding. So the way that echo sounding works is that you have a big cruise ship, big research cruise ship. It has an air gun on it. And the air gun generates a sonic blast, and the sonic blast hits the bottom, and it bounces back, and it's picked up by all of these recorders here. So you see all these recorders being dragged through the ocean. Okay, so that's kind of just a gif of what's going on here. You could see how, if you can parse apart how the different parts of the signal arrive at different times, you can figure out the exact shape and depth of the ocean floor, the ocean bottom. Okay, so that's what happened. Harry Hess, I mean, people do this. I mean, just, this is a big full-time job for many scientists, just plotting out the depths of the seafloor and going back and forth. But this is basically what the picture, this is the picture that we get about ocean floor depths. And so this is a beautiful map of what the ocean floor looks like, right? In terms of elevation, or depth, I should say. So, close to the continents, we have this area called the continental shelves. And then it's relatively shallow. It's really only like maybe 500 meters deep. Then you move off of the continental shelf, it gets deep very fast. So you have this part called the continental slope. And then you get into these areas that are very deep, 12,000 feet deep, 5,300 meters, right? The average depth of the ocean is 4,000 meters, by the way. So it gets very deep, and then all of a sudden it starts to rise again, and you get this ridge. And I mean, this is just a crazy thing, because in the middle of the ocean, imagine how surprised Harry Hess would have been, all these people, when they find in the middle of the ocean, here is a mountain chain. They find the longest mountain chain in the whole world. There's no mountain chain longer than the mid-Atlantic ridge. It's 2 to 3 kilometers high. So in some places you're talking about 10,000 foot mountains. In the middle of the ocean, it's all submerged. Isn't that a crazy thing you think about? You got all these mountains, the biggest mountain chain in the whole world, it's all submerged. It's underwater. So it's pretty interesting. This is what they discovered by echo sounding the seafloor. And of course, this wasn't around in Alfred Wegener's days, okay? So it had to come till after his death. So it's like, what is this ridge and what is it about? Very strange, very odd. What could that mountain mean? Now, another technology that was developed after World War II and the advent of geophysicists is this thing called magnetic anomalies, and exploration of magnetic anomalies. So what on earth is a magnetic anomaly? What does that mean? Okay, you all know that we have an outer core, and you all know, I hope, that the outer core is spinning, it's circulating, and it's generating a magnetic field, right? So you all with me on that? So what is kind of interesting is that the rocks of Earth have recorded that magnetic field over Earth's history. So you know that we have two poles. We have a North Pole and a South Pole. And what we find is that the rocks of Earth contain a mineral called magnetite. And that magnetite is like a little magnet. It's like a little compass. And when you have all these little magnetite grains, so imagine you have a melt. So here's a box full of molten basalt. You have all these little magnetite grains floating around in here, okay? Let's say they're all made like this. And what happens is that as they're floating around in the melt, they orient themselves. So then here comes the magnetic field with north. So here comes the magnetic field lines, right? The grains will orient themselves. So I'll erase these grains here. The grains will orient themselves with the direction of north. So they'll look like this. Okay. So, does that make sense? So what ends up happening is that we have a record of Earth's magnetic field over Earth's history. Okay, that's really useful because that can tell us what the direction of magnetic north was at the time the rock formed. So what we find actually is that magnetic north has not always been in the same place as it is now. In fact, it seems that from time to time it has switched with the south. This happens every maybe 700,000 years. North will switch with south, kind of just spontaneously. It just comes from the fluid dynamics of the outer core. Sometimes that whole magnetic field will just flip. Okay? So what ends up happening is that the rocks record these magnetic field reversals, and we can actually pick it up. We can actually detect these magnetic field reversals in the magnetite of the ocean floor remotely using these magnetometers. So it's pretty cool. I mean, it blows my mind in a way that you can do this, but they drag these magnetometers behind ships, and they can actually pick up whether the rocks of the seafloor below have a normal north polarity or if it's reversed. So it'll go along the seafloor, and what you end up is this pattern of normal and reversed fields. Normal and reversed fields. So this should be down. Normal and reversed fields. Okay. So isn't that interesting? You know, you're on this ship. You're dragging this magnetometer behind you. You're picking up these changes in the orientation of the magnetic field preserved in the rocks of the seafloor below. And what you find is a pattern of normal and reversed field lines. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. If you look on either side of the mid-ocean ridge, the lines are exactly the same. They're symmetrical. So the lines are symmetrical about the ridge. So here's a peak here, a peak here. It matches that peak. This peak matches that peak. This peak matches this peak. This peak matches this peak. This peak matches this peak, and this one matches this one. Okay? So you're actually getting the exact replica on either side of the mid-ocean ridge. What does that mean? You know, when people saw this, they were like, what on earth could this possibly mean? And smart people put, two and two together. It means that the ocean floor is being generated from the mid-ocean ridge. And as the rocks formed symmetrically from the mid-ocean ridge, they were recording the magnetic direction, magnetic north direction at the time, and you create this symmetrical pattern on either side of the mid-ocean ridge in terms of magnetic anomalies. Okay, so the last one that came about that proved, that Alfred Wegener was right, was radiometric dating of the ocean floor. So when they actually were able to develop the science well enough in the 1940s, actually I think it was 1940, Claire Patterson came out with his groundbreaking paper on the age of the Earth from radiometric isotopes. We're going to have a whole lecture on radiometric isotopes, so you'll learn more about that later. But they measured the age of the ocean floor, and what did they find? About the ridge, close to the ridge, right? The mid-ocean ridges, it's young. As you get further from the ridge, it gets older and older and older and older. It's telling the same story as what those magnetic anomalies were saying on the in the previous part of this lecture. The ridge is the source of the ocean floor. The ocean is spreading from the ridge. So you start off with a mid-ocean ridge, and it starts creating new seafloor. And the new seafloor is constantly being created at the mid-ocean ridge. And it's being created every day. Every day there's baby seafloor being created. Brand new, newborn seafloor. And it's spreading from this ridge. And as it spreads, it pushes the continents further and further away. And finally, there was an explanation for how continents could move over Earth's surface. The reason is seafloor spreading. The seafloor is spreading apart and pushing the continents away from each other. So people saw this and they were like, oh my gosh, Alfred Wegener was right. The continents are moving. He didn't know how. He knew they were moving, but he didn't know how. And people discovered the how later. They move by seafloor spreading. So, I don't have this lovely video for you about the, I wish I could play that. But it's just a video about showing the volcanoes on the ocean floor. So I'll have to skip it this time. But okay, so the seafloors are spreading. But how can continents move across the surface of the Earth? It's like what? So I'm answering the question, what is driving the seafloor spreading? And the answer is, it's the mantle beneath the continents. It's undergoing convection. The convection is powering seafloor spreading. It's powering plate tectonics. It's powering continental drift. And it's all due to mantle convection. And mantle convection is all due to the Earth trying to shed its heat. So here we go. This is the mantle convecting. Mantle convection, the mantle is solid, but it moves slowly. It shifts slowly over time. Solid state convection of the mantle. And this is all done to release the heat of Earth. Okay, so this is really just Earth's way of cooling down, and plate tectonics is just way for Earth to cool down. It's almost like like we have a sweat system, to cool ourselves. We sweat. That's how our body cools itself. Earth does plate tectonics. Okay. So that's the end of this part 1 of plate tectonics lecture. I'm going to get more into the nitty-gritty of plate tectonics theory in detail next time. But I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I will be following up with the next one pretty soon. So until then, have a good week.